Hello, I'm Pete Woodcock and welcome to another in the Key Concepts in Political Theory. Here again, I'm talking about Political Theory, A Beginner's Guide, my book, and we're still in Chapter 6 in the issue of freedom. Now, this is intended to follow on from my previous video, which I did on the difference between positive and negative freedom. I've put the link to that in the description if you haven't managed to have a look. So have a look at that. And of course, if you like this overall, you know the drill. Please like and subscribe, and then these can come straight to you. So what I wanted to do relatively briefly in this video is to try and show that the dichotomy between positive and negative liberty is not the end of the story on freedom, as you might well imagine. Just a very brief recap. Remember, Isaiah Berlin, in his dichotomy between positive and negative liberty, identified negative liberty or negative freedom as being the absence of constraints, whereas positive freedom is more about the ability to do something. And he identified a sort of a narrative in the history of political thought around negative freedom, which are people, I don't know, like Hobbes and Mill, a pluralist view of freedom, and then you have sort of Rousseau, Plato, Hegel, and so on and so forth, who are proponents more of positive liberty. And of course, Isaiah Berlin was defending negative liberty as a view of freedom. But I suppose it's all too easy for us to imagine that freedom does fall into these nice camps of negative and positive freedom. And what I want to talk about in this little video is freedom as non-domination, or Republican freedom, which challenges this notion that there are two distinct camps of freedom. And here I'm talking about the work of Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit. In particular, I think a very nice introduction to this is Quentin Skinner's Liberty Before Liberalism, which is on this topic. And I should add that at the end of the book, it's really quite interesting on the methodology of the history of political thought as well. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Now, what Quentin Skinner argues is that non-interference is problematic as a view of liberty, because he asks us to imagine the following situation. And I should point out that Quentin Skinner likewise is saying that this is a narrative that has gone in the history of political thought. It's not per se something that he's invented, but he's highlighted it, and Philip Pettit very much is promoting it thereafter. Imagine that you have an absolute monarch or an absolute dictator who has all power in a particular country, the country in which you live. Now, imagine that this ruler either forgot that he had powers, or he was a benevolent, or she was a benevolent dictator, and just sort of said, get on with it, do what you want. Now, he argues that in that situation, the ruler or the state wouldn't be interfering with you. So you would be free in the negative liberal sense of freedom, because no one will be telling you what to do, no one will be interfering with your actions. Now, of course, Quentin Skinner and the Republican tradition argue that there's something wrong here. That is to say, is that if your freedom depends upon the will of another, you might as well not have that freedom. So freedom can't possibly be about just the lack of interference or the lack of hindrance, because if your lack of hindrance depends upon someone else's will, then it's problematic. Milton talks about this in his critique of censorship. He argues that why censorship is so problematic is not simply because you'll write a poem or you'll do a piece of work and hand it to the censor and that they'll change it, but that you will end up writing poetry, writing stuff to get past the censor. So the power ends up changing how you act. And consequently, we in a political situation might end up flattering the person with power, trying to make sure that our freedom is never denied, and then we end up not really being ourselves and being flatterers of power, and that this dominates us. So we can be free in terms of the lack of interference and yet still be dominated, according to Skinner and the Republican tradition of freedom as non-domination. So Skinner argues that this means that freedom as non-domination is neither a negative view of liberty, because it's not just about interference, nor does he argue is it a positive view of liberty. The argument that Skinner gives here is kind of, a lot of positive liberty is bound up with notions of democracy and taking absolute control. And Skinner argues that the Republicans weren't necessarily particularly interested in people taking control of things. What they were interested in is that nobody else would impose their control over us. So freedom of non-domination is neither negative liberty nor positive liberty. And this critiques this dichotomy, therefore, of positive and negative liberty, because one can be said to be not free even when one isn't being interfered with. I should briefly point out that I've been talking about Pettit and Skinner as if they're saying the same thing. There are subtle differences between them. If I've understood it correctly, Quentin Skinner argues that Republican freedom is freedom as non-domination. Sorry, I'll say that again. Freedom as non-domination and lack of interference. Whereas for Pettit, Republican freedom is just non-domination. So there are some problems. But this, I think, poses an interesting critique to it. If one was to be hypercritical, we are proponents of political theory. We're interested in political theory, and if one was to set up a set of institutions, because I should point out, Republicans take institutions very seriously. You need to balance power and so on and so forth. But if one was to set up a set of institutions which would guarantee that government wouldn't interfere with us and our freedom, and we were going to set up a set of institutions that that protected our freedom in terms of non-domination, those sets of institutions, I would imagine, would be pretty similar. We might be talking about bills of rights and democratically elected parliaments and separation of the powers. How this plays out on a political standpoint is maybe less clear. However, psychologically, it feels to me an important contribution to the debate on liberty, that if our freedom really does depend upon us flattering someone else, then that is highly problematic. So there it is. Like and subscribe, please, and we'll move on to another discussion from my book, Political Theory, A Beginner's Guide. In the next video, we'll maybe move away from freedom and dip our toes into something else next time. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.